Mike, do you want to give a little bit of a background on yourself? I mean, you're a filmmaker. You are a producer and writer for the Empire Files. You're the co-host of the Eyes Left pod. You're
sure.
socialist.
Yeah. I mean, I guess my qualification to talk about this topic, I'm a producer of the show called The Empire Files, which you can find on YouTube. I made a film with my partner, Abby Martin, called Gaza Fights for Freedom. But, I've been a kind of journalist on the issue of Afghanistan for a long time. In fact, the first article I ever published back in 2008 was about the Afghanistan war, and I've done media work on it ever since. The Empire Files done a few documentaries about the Afghanistan war. But I think more so my involvement has been as a veteran. I mean, someone in my, I went to the Iraq War. I was in the Army when 9/11 happened. I had joined like 1 month before the 9/11 attacks. And so I kind of witnessed the 9/11 transformation, while I was still in training. But, all of my, even though I just went to Iraq for a year, all my friends and, people I loved ended up going to Afghanistan. And, going through all of that, but also as an organizer. And so, that speech that you showed in 2010, I'd been a part of organizing actions against the Afghanistan war for years prior to that and many years after, and in particular organizing with active duty soldiers against the Afghanistan war. And so for years I was, going on to army bases and doing outreach to meet soldiers who were opposed to the Afghanistan war and were getting deployed who didn't want to go, working with family members whose loved ones had been to Afghanistan and came home and killed themselves. And so like this kind of really intimately involved with the war throughout the duration and kind of seen it at every point from the very beginning up until, what we just saw Biden do. And it's been a lot of twists and turns. And I think that it's, what we just saw was an end of the war that should have never started. And, when I give that speech in 2010, at that point in 2010, the Pentagon, the politicians, they had already acknowledged there's no possible way for us to win this thing. And they spent the next decade or more just trying to make a bunch of money off it to make the best of a lost war, which made a lot of people rich, but killed a lot of more people who didn't have to die in the process.
Do you want to tell people what happened after you gave that speech?
Yeah, I was arrested. And there was probably like over 100 other veterans who were arrested, including Afghanistan veterans. And we were arrested for demonstrating outside the White House where we shouldn't be. That was probably the third time I was arrested demonstrating against the war. But it wasn't just like I was some unique person or individual. I was always arrested with like 100 other veterans. And, like that speech and others of mine, it's been cool that they've become popular, but I was just kind of one of like a mass movement of soldiers at that time. So as soon as the Iraq war started, there was a real upsurge of people in the active duty military who became opposed to the war and then became activists against it. So I'm just like a product of that generation. That's been true. The Vietnam War, pretty much every war the U.S. has fought, there's been a sector of the military that has turned against it. So I'm just one of many who, went through that experience.
Yeah. So I wanted to have you on for obvious reasons today to talk about what's going on in Afghanistan, but I just wanted to give a little bit of background information because there's a lot of new people here. Many people say I'm the gateway to leftist thought. So there's a lot of baby leftists in here. So I just wanted to give a little bit more background. You're an organizer with the PSL as well, right? You are an avowed socialist. Out and about.
Yeah, and actually, that's the funny story. Like, I got out of the Army in 2005. I was really mad about the war. I felt really betrayed, lied to, that everything was bullshit that I was told going in, lied to about the Iraq war. And, I came back, really angry. And I didn't realize at the time, but there was like this massive anti-war movement in the streets. And I immediately, that drew me in. So I started organizing like car caravans from Florida to go to Washington, D.C. for these, like the demonstrations were huge, like 100,000 people, 200,000 people would be marching on Washington, marching on the Pentagon to end the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And, but it wasn't enough for me to like go to the demonstrations. I wanted to like, who's organizing these? And the PSL was one of the groups that I saw being kind of really at the forefront of organizing those actions and mobilizing people with a group called the Answer Coalition. And so that's, that was my gateway in. I felt wasn't enough for me to just show up. I had to try to get other people out. And that kind of defined my life for the next long time.
So you listened to the Joe Biden speech, as we all did, I assume.
Yeah.
What did you think about it overall? Let's get started on that.
I mean, I agree with your reaction that he actually he held strong. He said, we're going to end the war regardless of the consequences. We're going to get out. And that was good. I mean, it's funny because all of these people that have been like praising Donald Trump when he was in office as like the most anti-imperialist president we ever had. If Donald Trump was still president now and he stood up and gave that speech, there'd all be these headlines: Donald Trump, the anti-imperialist president, the establishment's trying to stop him from ending the war, all this stuff. I'm sure they're not going to be saying that about Biden. But I
think the liberal media, on the other hand, probably still would be mercilessly ripping into Donald Trump in a similar capacity to how they're ripping into Joe Biden right now, saying that like he's horrible and he's personally responsible for everything that's going on in Afghanistan. It's been really surprising seeing that. Not really surprising. Of course, we know that the mainstream media has a massive a boner for warmongering, obviously, but certainly Fox News, you're right, would be talking about how incredible it is that he is, a peaceful dove. And this is his execution, right? I mean, this is, as far as we know, what is going on right now is Joe Biden executing the previous administration's negotiations with the Taliban and the Afghan government.
So, yeah, I mean, that's pretty much right. So I think it's Trump's legacy in Afghanistan is a pretty horrible one. I mean, Trump came into office. The U.S. was already drawing down and had intended to pull out anyway. Like the Pentagon knew it eventually had to get out of Afghanistan. Trump comes into office and he not only like triples the number of U.S. troops. So he's credited with removing troops, but he tripled the number of U.S. troops there. U.S. deaths and Afghan deaths started skyrocketing. And Trump actually presided over the most number of civilian casualties 2 years in a row than any other previous year of the war, which is saying a lot. More than the Obama troop surge, when like 140,000 U.S. troops alone, plus NATO, plus mercenaries, were flooded through the country. Trump managed to, with his loosening of like restrictions on airstrikes and so forth, just massacred massive numbers of civilians under his tenure. And so any kind of anti-war cred that Trump gets for negotiating this deal with the Taliban is kind of wiped away by the huge civilian toll that he took. But the war was lost for a long time. And so, yes, Trump negotiated this, peaceful exit of the United States with the Taliban. And, as Biden said in his speech, he said, if we were not gone by May 1st, we'd have to re-engage in Afghanistan. That was an admission of defeat. Because, the Taliban gave a warning to the U.S. after Trump left office. They said, if you're not out by May 1st, we're going to start triggering mass casualty events for U.S. soldiers. So the U.S. knew that they didn't have the capability to fight that. They had long been defeated by the Taliban on the battlefield. So they knew that they really had to get out. And so I think the interesting thing about Biden's speech is because he's acting like he just came in and like inherited this war. I mean, he's been a supporter of the Afghanistan war since the very beginning. He said in his speech even, I was against the troop surge. Like, that's kind of disingenuous. Yes, he was against the troop surge of like 70,000 additional troops, but he advocated sending just like 20 or 30,000 additional troops, so just a smaller surge, and has never advocated for the full withdrawal of Afghanistan. Even when he was campaigning against Trump, said we need to leave like 3,000 or 4,000 troops because we can't abandon the Afghan government. And so I think the important thing for everyone to understand is we never should have been in Afghanistan to begin with. You talked on your stream prior to the Biden speech. You gave a really good report about that. There's no reason to. There's no to get revenge for 9/11, get Al Qaeda, whatever. There's no reason for the U.S. to invade. But let's just look at from the military standpoint. The U.S. had been defeated, knew it had been totally defeated militarily by the Taliban in like 2010, 2011. When Obama did this troop surge, he gave the whole rationale. We can win, but we have to beat back the Taliban and then create a stable Afghan government. That completely failed. It completely went up in smoke. If you want, we can talk a little about how badly the U.S. was actually defeated. I don't think people really can grasp how on the ground it was just like a total military defeat at the hands of the Taliban insurgency. But they knew in like 2010, 2011, they knew that there was no military victory against the Taliban. Even with all that huge surge of 100,000 American troops, they could make zero gains against the Taliban forces. So all this talk that Biden was giving about how many more will die in a war that we can't win, well, they could have. So what was the last 10 years been? The last 10 years has literally been everyone in the Pentagon, the generals, and everyone in Washington. They all knew this. that there is no possible way to win on the ground, and the Afghan military had no capabilities to prevent a Taliban takeover when we leave. They've known that for over a decade. But they figured, well, this is really good for the military because we have all this extra money that we can just dump into developing new weapons, new machinery, all types of new like expanding our arsenal. And all of that money just goes to defense contractors, to oil companies, all the different war profiteers that make up, the bulk of the big industries in this country. They were all just making a killing off of getting, as I mentioned in that speech, like $700 million, $800 million a day of U.S. tax dollars just going straight into the war industry. So the politicians in Washington, I mean, they're not dying in Afghanistan. They're not getting their legs blown off in Afghanistan. What the hell do they care? The generals in the Pentagon, I mean, the Afghanistan war is good for them. They get to put on a medal every time they go to Afghanistan. They get awards for valor for just sitting back on these bases and not watching dots on the map of their soldiers going and getting killed in random remote valleys that mean absolutely nothing to them. And so it's good for their careers. And then they get out of the military and they go right into jobs on the board of director for defense contractors with all of their war battle-tested experience that they got in Afghanistan. So for the elites, for the Pentagon officers, the Pentagon brass, and for the politicians in Washington, all of their friends in the defense contractor industries, the Afghanistan war was fine. It didn't matter that, a few dozen soldiers were dying every year. They don't care. It's not their families. And so they thought, well, we've obviously lost the war. Let's just keep dragging it out. And maybe somewhere down the line, they knew they were eventually going to leave. And there's been a retreat since 2011. The U.S. has been retreating, but in slow motion. So every year the troop numbers dropped. Every year we restricted back to smaller and smaller areas. The U.S. empire knew it eventually had to leave because, it looks pretty bad for the world's most powerful empire to be being defeated on the ground by an insurgency using rifles from 100 years ago. So they knew that eventually they had to get out of the quagmire because it's just doesn't look good for you as an empire. But they figured, there's no rush. We'll make a bunch of money on the way out. We'll build up our military a lot on the way out, and then we'll be ready to turn towards some other target once we fully leave.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of, for people who don't know this, Afghanistan is ripe with minerals, a lot of natural resources that the American military and other contractors that are American usually were able to extract. It was a fundamental reason for why they stayed for as long as they did, while also, I guess, in some capacity, training the Afghan military forces that, of course, immediately got rolled over by the Taliban. And I personally suspect that, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but I talked about this earlier. I don't know if you agree with me on it or not, but I personally think that this was a situation where they were like, look, we are going to get the trillions of dollars of minerals regardless. We might as well do the same contracts with the Taliban so there's actually some stability, and then we can send in, Blackwater or Academy into Afghanistan instead of the American military directly being involved there and doing it themselves. And I thought that, this would be regional stability for everyone if the Taliban were the people that the American government was dealing with rather than the Afghan government that was never going to be able to push back on the Taliban if they decided to take violent means and kill a bunch of people and eventually and inevitably overtake the government regardless.
No, you're absolutely right. And the U.S. government was trying to negotiate with the Taliban right from when they took over through the 90s under Bill Clinton. And they were negotiating because they wanted to build an oil pipeline in Afghanistan. I mean, Afghanistan is an extremely important geopolitical location for resources, neighboring all these oil-rich former Soviet republics. And so the Clinton administration was fine with the Taliban. I mean, there was even groups of Taliban that were flown to Texas to go to the Unocal oil executives ranch to have meetings about developing these oil pipelines. So the U.S. never had a problem with the Taliban government. But they were just kind of difficult to deal with. They wanted to develop these pipelines, but the Taliban were dragging their feet. They didn't really care about it. And so they were just they weren't the best business partner. And so 9/11, and we can't just look at it in the vacuum of Afghanistan. When 9/11 happened, the United States government said, great, this is perfect. Every government in the region that is not a total client or neo-colony of the United States, now's our ticket to go take them all out. Why did they want to take out the Taliban government? Not because the Taliban had anything to do with 9/11, which they didn't. Not because they weren't cooperating with the U.S. in anti-terrorism operations. They were. The Taliban were just annoying to deal with as business partners. So they figured, oh, we'll just go in Afghanistan, knock down the Taliban real quick, set up a puppet government that's a neo-colony of the United States, and will give us all the contracts to mine the minerals and build the oil pipeline. Then we'll go to Iraq and take down that government really easily, and then set up a puppet government that'll give us all the oil contracts. Then we'll go to Iran and do the same thing. Syria do the same thing. Lebanon do the same thing. Sudan do the same thing. Somalia do the same thing. I mean, and a lot of those countries Biden named in his speech of places we need to turn towards, not being bogged down in Afghanistan. So that was the goal of the U.S. empire and imperialism in the wake of 9/11, was go to this region, which was like a bastion of anti-imperialism and resistance to U.S. domination, and just this total imperial arrogance to think that they could just go in and easily overthrow these governments and install puppet governments, and then it would just go very easily. And it just shows you like just the hubris and the arrogance of the people in Washington and the Pentagon who like have so much control over our lives. They're complete idiots. And so it both blew up in their faces. The Iraq War completely blew up in their face. They were totally defeated militarily on the ground and effectively retreated in defeat. And the same thing happened in Afghanistan. But Afghanistan's a little different because they were able to drag it out a lot longer. And, it's the same thing with Vietnam. After the U.S. knew they had lost in Vietnam, militarily anyway, of course, still was a lot to gain for the war industry. But instead of just saying, okay, there's no possible way to achieve our objectives, we don't want to kill any more people and we don't want any more people to die, they adopted a strategy called like peace with honor, which meant just bombing, killing millions extra people and sending 100,000 or so more soldiers to their deaths before they eventually retreated. And that's what happened in Afghanistan. I mean, there is no reason why they couldn't have left a decade ago. And like I remember when Obama, I mean, it should have never been there. Leaving a decade ago would have been very popular. I remember when Obama gave his speech announcing the troop surge at West Point and everything. And I was gathered with a bunch of military families, mostly mothers, and whose sons were in the military, had been to Afghanistan 4 or 5 times, been to Iraq a bunch of times, and thinking that Obama was going to end the war. And Obama's speech actually turned into, we're escalating the war, but then we're going to end it in 3 years, and by 2014, it'll be over. And it was just this room of all these moms just like sobbing, knowing that they were like so tired. They're done. And here was Obama saying, you got to just stick through it another 4 years, just another 4 years, and then we'll really end the war. And the main rationale, Obama said, we can't leave now. We have to keep sacrificing lives because we can't let the Taliban take over. Now it's like the main reason. We cannot let the Taliban take over, and that's the only rationale to continue fighting. Well, they knew that there was no stopping that. They knew that wasn't a possibility to defeat the Taliban, but they just lied and kept it going. And I think the Afghanistan papers, which were released in 2019, blows the lid off the whole thing. And for some reason, it implicates Biden. For some reason, it wasn't a big issue in the election campaign. He got asked like one question about it in one of the primary debates. But just what the Afghanistan papers did was showed that the Pentagon, all the commanders in Afghanistan, were saying to the White House, by every metric, we have lost the war and have no possibility of turning it around. And so the Obama administration, the White House, turned back to them and said, well, if we're losing by every metric, create a metric that shows that we're succeeding. And so there's this directive given to just create these kind of fake examples of how, actually there's hope to be had in the Afghanistan war. The people shouldn't turn against it, just another couple years and we can turn this around. And it just says everything about the American government. They knew that it was hopeless, but they just kept lying to the people who were having to send their sons and daughters to die and be killed or kill other people. Kept dropping bombs on poor families in Afghanistan for a mission that they knew they couldn't accomplish. And the whole time, really, they were just like, well, if we kill enough people, then maybe the Taliban will give all these concessions when we leave and allow us to form a unity government where our puppet forces have 50% of the government. So everyone who died in Afghanistan, everyone who died in the U.S. military, it was all just to pressure the Taliban into giving some concessions. And so it's kind of shows that you just can never trust these people.
But there was absolutely zero reason, right? I mean, there was no
Right.
reason for the Taliban to ever give concessions because they could just wait it out. They already dominated
exactly.
areas outside of Kabul regardless. And even in some instances, they were seen as liberators in areas outside of Kabul regardless, historically. So they already had, all they need to do is lay back and sit back and wait for the inevitable attrition to get to a point where the American military simply cannot continue occupying Afghanistan. And it did
Yeah,
literally happen. That's where we're at now.
no, that's absolutely right. And the Pentagon has known that the whole time. I mean, just an example of how bad the war was lost. I mean, when the troop surge era, when they just sent, it's one thing, casualties are low when like the US forces just hold up on these massive bases in Kabul and Bagram and other places where it's very fortified. It's hard to, you can shoot some rockets in there, but even that's hard because it's just all open land ahead of it that's patrolled by drones and everything. But when the U.S. sent its military out to all of these outposts all over the countryside of Afghanistan, I mean, I have a lot of friends who went through this and who were there. I mean, you're talking about, 40 guys, 40 U.S. troops just sent on like a hilltop in the middle of the countryside in Afghanistan. And every day, your normal routine would be you'd go on a patrol through the village and through the farmland. The patrol had no purpose other than to say, hey, we're here patrolling. And that's what you do when you've won a war. Just so some generals back in Kabul in the command center could point at a map and say, oh, yeah, look where our soldiers are. Like, we're winning the war. Every time you'd go on a patrol, you'd just be getting shot at from people you couldn't even see, who were like 1,000 meters away, just taking pot shots at you and shooting a bunch of your guys. Nothing to shoot back at because you don't even know where they are. On your way back after getting shot at for a few hours and being pinned down in the middle of a grape field or something, someone gets blown up by an IED because the Taliban knows exactly where you're going to walk. During the troop surge, the wounds to genitalia of soldiers increased like 95%. That became like the number one wound for soldiers, was just getting your shit blown off. But then the signature wound really became triple amputees. So 2 legs and an arm became the characteristic wound of just totally pointless patrols, just going out just for the sake of walking out. So then you go on this patrol every day where someone gets shot, someone gets killed, someone gets their legs blown off. Then you go back to the base and then spend the night under total assault by, sometimes you'd have like 500 Taliban fighters assaulting a base with 40 US soldiers on it. And almost, in a lot of cases, actually like overrunning the base, like getting over the wire and having to be killed, Taliban being killed inside the actual American base. And the only thing that prevented just all the bases from being wiped out is the job of US soldiers was just to be basically bait, to be sitting ducks, to draw a Taliban attack, and just stay alive long enough for air support to get there. So once you start getting attacked, you call in the Apaches, you call in the B-52s to just lay waste to the villages and everything that's all around it. And so it's just a completely insane situation. It made absolutely no sense from like a military strategy point of view. The generals knew that it was just completely pointless, but you know what? Every time their soldiers got shot at, you had a major, you had a lieutenant colonel, you had a colonel getting a little award for valor, even though they weren't in the battle, so it was fine for them. And that just proved to be a totally pointless thing. And so after the surge, after us putting out these soldiers as bait everywhere in the middle of nowhere, they eventually said, okay, we'll pull back, and then we'll just bomb everything to try to exert some kind of pressure. So it's just, I mean, the essence of the war is just a bunch of senseless killing for a mission that they knew was completely hopeless, but they figured, you know what? It's good for our military, it's good for our war economy. So, and there's not a lot of opposition, a lot of pressure for us to end it, so why bother? Let's just keep it going as long as we feel we can.
And then there was also the abysmal failure that I talked about for 4 hours yesterday with respect to our training program of the Afghan security forces, where officers were told by high command to turn the other cheek or look the other way when the routine raping of little kids was happening by the Afghan security forces that we were training. So I do find it additionally laughable when liberal warmongers turn around and say things like, well, what about the women that we were defending when we were out there? When it's like, okay, I mean, the Taliban are brutal. Don't get me wrong. Do not misunderstand me. They are a fundamentalist, a brutal group of militants that are still, in every sense of the word, not demonstrating the will of the Afghan people, even though they are demonstrating it more than having an American puppet state installed, certainly. But the training program overall was a disaster. The government was a disaster. We spent $90 billion on that training alone, and only for them to roll over and completely drop their arms, which are now in the hands of the Taliban, by the way, over the course of a week and of the final 72 hours. So I have a question for you. What do you say to the people who want to continue that? Like, what do you say to the people that want to extend the senseless brutality that we subjected the Afghan civilians to, and also the American military members to? What do you have to say to liberal media? Should we just airdrop, every single person that has talked about how much they need to be there, how much we need to have permanent occupation? That's what I'm thinking. Send fucking every DC wonk consultant that thinks it's a good idea to continue, defending the women of Afghanistan. Just send them out there. Let them, sit on a fucking forward operating base in the middle of Karengal Valley, getting shot at from all directions.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably a good solution from the beginning of the war. I mean, all the strongest advocates are people. It's easy to advocate for it because you're safe in Washington, D.C. And also, not only that, but you're in such like an elite world that you don't have any friends or family members that are being sent to go get killed. I mean, it's funny, the women's rights thing, because I'm wondering, like, do people think that there were like women's rights being advanced anywhere in Afghanistan outside of like the American Green Zone in Kabul? I mean, areas that were under U.S. control, U.S. occupation, there was no change in like the religious fundamental nature of what was going on there. It was, and I think people that can imagine that the U.S. military is kind of any kind of force for good or stability in the world. I mean, the most number of civilians, yes, there's a lot of civilians killed in like fighting between the U.S. and the Taliban that you could attribute to the Taliban killing, even though it's fighting from a war imposed by the United States. But the majority of civilians are killed by U.S. airstrikes. I mean, to say that the top killer of civilians in Afghanistan, and we're not talking just a few here and there. I mean, I think everyone was following the horror in Gaza, the Israeli siege on Gaza that happened just a few months ago. And it was horrifying because there were like families sleeping in their homes, have an Israeli bomb dropped on it, and the entire family is wiped out. I mean, that was like a daily occurrence in Afghanistan. It's very important that the Gaza got so much coverage, but there's almost this like complete disconnect with the American public and the American media with the kind of things that are being done with our tax dollars in our military. I mean, I don't think people would think that, every other day, the U.S. is dropping a bomb that lands on a house and kills 12 people of the same family, wipes out 3 generations in one airstrike. I mean, that was a typical occurrence by the U.S. military. And, like you mentioned, the raping kids, the Afghan forces, the U.S. forces were killing kids. I mean, the CIA in Afghanistan running these death squads, they actually did a couple operations where they went to religious schools, took all these young boys, some as young as like 9 years old, and shot them all in the head, executed them as like a form of terrorism to try to dissuade people from going to these religious schools, because one day they could become members of the Taliban if they go to this religious school. So the brutality and the violence of the U.S. occupation, which, no one wants to live under occupation. I mean, just because there's like, they advocate like women's rights, the soldiers occupying you, checking you, like patting you down every time you want to go in and out of your house, shooting up your village. They think they're taking fire from it. The risk of like a drone being dropped on your house just because you're in the vicinity of some fighting. I mean, the daily existence of life under a country at war and under foreign occupation is pretty devastating. And so I think that people have the picture in their mind, like the liberals advocating for like, what about the women? It's like they're really thinking about people in like one small area of Afghanistan was a complete fortress by the U.S. and NATO powers, but they don't want to look out. They don't want to look at actually what their government and their military was doing kind of outside that little bubble. And one last thing I'll say about how you said the training operation was like went up in smoke, and how that would just allowed these Afghan forces to do a lot of bad stuff. A lot of the civilian deaths and a lot of the war crimes and atrocities were carried out by Afghan forces working in concert with U.S. forces. So like definitely not the like socially progressive beacon of rights that you want to have running and taking over the country. But just to speak to the level of the U.S. defeat there, when the U.S. basically retreated from all the countryside and said, we're just getting our ass kicked out there, there's no reason to be out here, we're just going to go on these bases and just train our proxy forces. Well, U.S. troop deaths went down from IEDs and from being shot, but then the number one killer of U.S. troops became insider killings by the people that they were training. And this huge phenomenon exploded of guys who hated the U.S. just joining the Afghan army. And then a week later, they got an AK on a gun range and they just turn around and shoot the guys that are training them. And so from every angle, the U.S. just completely failed militarily. I mean, they couldn't even say, "Oh, we're just going to train these soldiers to do the dirty work for us." Then those soldiers started killing them. So it was just like a complete disaster.
Yeah, we were watching This Is What Winning Looks Like yesterday, where one of the officers literally was like, "We always have to have a gun trained on some of the Afghan forces that we are currently in the process of training, because you don't know who's going to turn around." And I guess, what's the military term for it? Blue Falcon? But I guess not
right.
even in that situation, I guess. Like, just turn around and just start fucking, shooting our guys. Guardian Angel.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and sometimes like they'd escape. Like there's this one photo, it'd probably be hard to find now, but there's like this young kid. This kid's probably like 16. He wasn't even a Taliban guy. He was just like, I fucking hate the United States. Like most people do. When you're under foreign occupation, you typically hate the foreign occupiers. It's like kind of a universal human thing. Like
I don't know what you're
Red
talking about.
Dawn,
It's
man.
crazy. Wait, they welcomed us as liberators, I thought.
It's like, and it's right. I mean, but that's the U.S. policy. Oh, they're actually going to like us. But there's this kid who was like 16, hated the U.S. He joined the Afghan army. He killed like 2 U.S. soldiers in training, and then somehow got off the base. And there's a photo of him being like carried on the shoulders of everyone in the village right outside the base. And he's like, "I did it. I got the Americans." And then he just like went on with his life. I mean, who knows what happened to him now? But like that's like the sentiment there. I mean, obviously there's people who like don't like the Taliban and are scared about what's going to happen. I think it's actually interesting that the Taliban have very clearly decided that they're pursuing a policy of like international credibility. So I don't know if you noticed, but like when they took all these major cities, there really wasn't fighting. Like the Afghan military just folded because like they just really don't care. Like in Kabul, there wasn't a shot fired when the Taliban came and took over Kabul.
Hold on. There were shots fired last night, Mike, as you also saw, by the American military shooting at people, civilians that they actually ended up murdering, for one last huzzah, for good old time's sake, where they murdered a bunch of civilians that were trying to desperately get onto airplanes and like literally fucking probably get thrown off the airplane inevitably when it takes off. But that's the sense of desperation amongst the civilian population of Kabul, that the American military was not allowing them to be on the air base or the field. So they ended up shooting 3 people.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, that's the most, I think, iconic images of the end of the Afghan. I mean, everyone's showing like the Chinook helicopter lifting off the roof like it was in Saigon, or the plane on the tarmac with all the people mobbing it. I think the most emblematic images we're seeing is of the soldiers shooting at civilians who are on the tarmac trying to escape. I mean, just until the very last moment, really embodying what the entire war has been. Just a horrible, and it's like, obviously the civilians are on your side. They're there trying to like escape the Taliban, but just total dehumanization and lack of care for the people of the country, and just kind of the readiness to use violence. But no shot was fired by the Taliban or by Afghan military resisting them. Most of the big cities that fell to the Taliban, there wasn't a shot fired, or there's almost no fighting. But the Taliban have announced, since they announced the new government, that they would allow safe passage to anyone who's leaving Afghanistan. So no one has to worry about, running to the planes as they're taking off. They're like, we're going to let you leave. They've said that they are going to honor their commitment to the United States to make sure that nobody is able to plan a terrorist attack against the United States from Afghan soil. They've even said, of course, the Taliban could just take over the entire government. The Taliban has said, we're going to allow figures from the previous puppet regime to be in the government. It's not just going to be all Taliban people. And they've even said that they're going to adopt more moderate policies. So the Taliban that you saw in power in the 90s, they're not going to do that again. And they're going to let women go to school and things like that.
I don't believe that, for the record.
I definitely don't. I agree with you, but they obviously are taking an approach to kind of have some kind of international credibility, to try to be seen as a legitimate government on the world stage after coming out of just such a long, protracted war. And so I think the reason I say that is because you could really quickly see the U.S. narrative turn around, where they start saying, actually, you know what? This shows that we won in Afghanistan because the Taliban aren't as bad, and it's because of us, and we succeeded in this or that, and then start doing business deals with them again like they wanted to in the 90s.
Yeah, I can absolutely see them like rolling out the red carpet on the Atlantic for like the mullah that now took over and is like going to be the new president, in the same way that they do with like MBS when he did his original like charm
New
offensive.
moderate.
And
Right.
everyone was like, oh my God, look how great the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is now. They're letting women drive. Meanwhile, like, the women that advocated for that were still being tortured in fucking prison. You know what I mean? Only recently released, by the way. So I can totally see that. And I do agree with you on that. And I do believe that that's what's going on. I think that there is going to be an effort to normalize the Taliban rule in government. We're going to look the other way. Right now, we're hyper focused on it. Then there's going to be an era where we look the other way, where the Taliban does whatever the fuck they want to do, ultimately to turn around and say, look, they're actually doing a great job. We won after all. We normalized and we made the Taliban progressive because, like I said, they're just going to be getting their contracts from the Taliban until they decide to no longer comply with the United States interests. And the other reason why I feel that way is because I'm seeing, I mean, you saw Dostum. I'm sure you're familiar with this person who is like Turkey's guy, basically, in the fight, who is a mercenary warlord, brutal dude, first vice president of Afghanistan, right? I think one of the that has been living in Turkey since 2009, originally come back to Afghanistan, and then only to immediately take his forces and leave for Uzbekistan. And that, to me, signals that, like, all of the regional leaders, including India, which the Taliban is making efforts to normalize relationships with, are functionally saying, like, we are the new guys in charge. You know, we are going to just, you know, implement Sharia law, of course, you know, the will of Allah. But having said that, we are going to, you know, we're not going to be doing the same stuff that we were doing back in the good old days of our occupation. So who knows? But seeing what, like, the deals that Russia clearly also struck with the Taliban, considering that their embassy, if I'm not mistaken, is completely untouched at this moment. Seeing that not a single a single shot has been fired thus far, and overtaking even Kabul, which was, you know, the tactical stronghold of the United States, the Green Zone, as you said. I feel as though their ultimate goals are to be the next administration in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and the U.S. is fine with that. In fact, they've been fine with the Taliban government since the troop surge. I mean, they knew then that there was no way to completely defeat the Taliban. They knew that it was either the Taliban totally takes over, or there's some kind of unity government where our puppets get some seats. And so all of it, this whole time of all this rhetoric of we have to defeat the Taliban, we have to keep fighting to defeat the Taliban, they were just bullshitting. They knew that they were never going to defeat them. And they knew that they were never going to keep them from power. It was just a question of how much power would they have in relation to the U.S. puppet forces. But the U.S. is also, I mean, the only reason they're leaving is because they're actually fine with the Taliban government if it kind of collaborates and cooperates in certain ways with the U.S. And Biden, in that speech, basically issued a threat saying if they don't cooperate, we can go back to just bombing them. So, of course, there's still going to be drones flying over, B-52 bombers whenever they feel like it. You know, the U.S. reserves the right to kill people in the world whenever it wants to for whatever reason, and that's kind of unquestioned. But they'll still be exerting pressure in that way if they're not getting what they want from the Taliban. But there's an important reason why the U.S. left Afghanistan. And it's the same reason why they drew down drastically in Iraq prior to the re-engagement in the war to defeat ISIS, but now they're drawing down again. And people remember when Obama came into office, he came in on all this rhetoric against the Iraq war. You know, this is the dumb war, Afghanistan is a smart war, but he also never said we should be in Afghanistan indefinitely. In fact, his policy for Afghanistan was to try to win the war quickly so we could leave, because of something he called the Asia pivot. And I think people have heard that term, the Asia pivot, the pivot towards China, but pivot away from what? And it was the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the Obama administration and the Pentagon leaders at that time were arguing it's really bad for the empire that we are bogged down in two unwinnable wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, even though we're making money there and even though it's helping us bolster our military and all the other benefits that come from a never-ending war, but we are failing to direct our forces toward our next enemies. China, Russia, of course, countries in Latin America, the U.S. wants to overthrow. And so there's all these other targets, and it's hard for imperialism to effectively overthrow and engage these other targets for regime change that they have, if they're bogged down, looking pretty bad in two disastrous wars that were supposed to be like the 9/11 revenge wars that makes the U.S. look good and strong in the world.
Even though there's nothing to do, especially in Iraq, with respect to 9/11, even remotely related, obviously, and also even with Afghanistan, there were multiple different avenues that we could have pursued that did not involve relentless bombing campaigns and also boots on the ground military warfare, or I don't know, giving bags of cash to fucking pedophile warlords that we shipped into Afghanistan into certain areas if the other warlord of the region was not complying with our demands to turn the other cheek or tell us about Taliban's movements every now and then.
Yeah, no, all of that, all the trillions of dollars that were spent in Afghanistan, the money that didn't go into like war profiteers in the U.S. were just like stolen by all the U.S. proxy forces, all the warlords, like basically just took that money and pocketed it, which is another reason why the Afghan military collapsed, because a lot of that money was just stolen by them. But, you know, I think there's like a lot of people were surprised that the war actually ended for that reason. It's like, well, there's so much money to be made in forever wars. There's so many minerals there that we don't want to give up and so forth. But like the imperialist state, the job of the Pentagon, the job of the government under a capitalist imperialist system is to manage the common affairs of the ruling class, the common interests of the ruling class. And so, yes, there were certain industries that probably lost out with the U.S. leaving Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, the people making all the bombs that are getting dropped, you know, the fuel companies that are providing all the fuel for the Apaches to fly over the country, you know, 24 hours a day. So, of course, there's some industries that are taking a hit, but the head of the empire said, it's better for our common interests as a collective ruling class, as the capitalist class as a whole, if we slow down these wars and direct towards other enemies that we want to conquer, that we want to take over, that we want to overthrow. And so the whatever credit Biden can get for ending the war, which, you know, Trump could have done it, but he chose not to because he chickened out. He could have ended it on his watch and been the president who ended the war as he promised when he was campaigning, but he chickened out. So Biden does, I guess, get credit for actually having the guts to be like, it's gonna be bad press, but I'm gonna take the fall. But the motives are not because it was wrong to have people dying in Afghanistan, people to be occupied. It was wrong to keep sending soldiers to have their legs blown off, but because they want to turn towards other targets for overthrow. And that's just that's the nature of imperialism. And that's how you can kind of rationalize why the U.S. would give up such a prize. Afghanistan was a huge prize. I mean, the U.S.'s main goals was to overthrow the government, develop it as a neo-colony, have unfettered access to its resources, and have military bases. The U.S. loves to have military bases in every country that it can, especially in Afghanistan. Being so close to China, India, former Soviet republics, it is a massive prize that the U.S. lost. It did not achieve those core objectives. And so why would they do that? Well, because it's more important for them to turn in other directions to overthrow, which, you know, at its core, it's completely rotten and criminal.
What do you think will happen next in Afghanistan? Like, what's your speculation, if you choose to speculate on it? And how do the people of Afghanistan liberate themselves? I mean, we didn't even offer historical context to this, but like, obviously, part of the reason why the Taliban is so strong, or was so strong originally, is because of the Mujahideen forces that were trained and also offered weapons by the United States government under Reagan as a counterweight towards the USSR and their interest in the region. Like, clearly, some of those people branched off, became the Taliban. Some of those people became Al Qaeda. Some of those people actually fought the Taliban. Obviously, it's very complex. There's like different warring tribes that have always worked there. But what we do know is that any sort of socialist, any sort of leftist momentum was completely squashed in a way that we see all around the world, led by, you know, Western imperialist forces, or led by Israel in the case of Hamas, because a lot of these reactionary forces are often seen as a counterbalance, a counterweight towards any sort of like socialist organizing, any sort of socialist militia, which is the true enemy, and that's the genuinely fearful organization, even if it's the people's actual will. So right now there isn't necessarily, as far as I've seen, there isn't necessarily like any sort of momentum against the Taliban. and I don't even know if there ever can be one. What do you see for the future of Afghanistan?
You're right. I mean, Afghanistan was becoming increasingly socially progressive. It had a vibrant socialist movement, which took power in the Sour Revolution in the 70s, which, of course, the U.S. did everything it could to destroy. And just like you mentioned, like in Iran, like in Lebanon, like in Palestine, the kind of focus on nationalist forces gives a space to more religious forces to ascend, and then they end up dealing with those religious forces. But I think it brings together, this point about can a U.S. humanitarian intervention exist? Like anytime you have when a country is in under a foreign occupation and in a war, in every sense, every single person who lived in Afghanistan, their daily reality was war. That becomes the main contradiction in a society. And so, how can you think about social progress or building social progress or socialist or left-wing organizations forming and fighting for more rights and presenting a left-wing alternative or challenge to the religious forces in the country when you're in a state of war and when you're under occupation? That becomes just the last thing on the list on people's minds. It becomes impossible to actually do it. And so, yes, of course we want to see Afghanistan progress into what is in its roots. I mean, it is in Afghanistan's very recent history to be pushing towards extreme levels of social progress, rights movement, all that stuff. That's in Afghanistan's history and blood. That wasn't brought from any other country. That was organic to Afghanistan and some people's lifetimes who may be watching this. It wasn't that long ago. But of course, that is completely hindered and blocked by being in a state of war. And so now, with the full withdrawal of U.S. and NATO forces, now Afghanistan can start on that path of moving in that direction. Now opens up new space for people to fight for what's right and to bring society to a different place. And that's true anywhere. As long as you're in the state of attack by the United States or imperialist powers, of course that's going to slow any kind of other progress. And another thing I think is going to happen is what always happens is the U.S. is going to try to rewrite the history of the Afghanistan war. And that's why it's important that you're doing this stream. You've done coverage of this. It's like when Obama ended the war in Iraq, he declared this new holiday, I think called Freedom Day, which is to mark the end of the Iraq war, and gave this whole narrative about what the Iraq war really was. We freed the Iraqi people, we gave them a better life, whatever. And it's just a complete disgusting rewrite of history. They did the same thing with Vietnam, with Korea, with all their wars. They like to rewrite the history. And so now that the chapter is closed on Afghanistan, you're going to see Washington, the media, start writing a new narrative of what the war was about, what we did, what we accomplished, all of that stuff. And one thing they're going to leave out of that narrative is that there was a vibrant movement against it, even though it was small at times the entire way, including from people in the military who are resisting the war, refusing orders, and things like that.
All right. Well, dude, thank you so much for coming on. Do you have any other final parting words? I don't want to take up more of your time. This was incredible.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you having me on.
Did you ever think that you would be? Did you ever think that you would, as a socialist, as an open socialist, be one of the top broadcasted streams on any platform whatsoever, and be able to say stuff like that?
Optimism, man. Reason for my optimism, man, is that these politics weren't always accepted, and now they're becoming so popular, and that gives me a lot of hope for the future. Just parting words. I really appreciate you having me on. If people want to learn more, see more of my work, have a show called The Empire Files that's hosted by my partner, Abby Martin. Got a lot of stuff there. And I think that just the thing to keep in mind is that the U.S. isn't done. I mean, just like after Vietnam, the U.S. was humiliated in Vietnam, left in a humiliating, embarrassing retreat. But that didn't mean the empire was falling and crumbled and was slowed down. It just turned its sights towards Latin America and started sponsoring all of these horrible, dirty wars and regime change in Latin America, turned towards the Middle East. So what you're seeing in the media now, the establishment, the ruling class, the elites, they're very upset that they're being embarrassed right now. That's why Biden is under so much pressure. I mean, they thought they were going to be getting all this glory for ending the war. That's why Biden is planning this 9/11 celebration to honor his ending the forever war. Kamala Harris back in April leaked to the press that actually I'm the one that helped convince Biden to pull out because they all thought it was going to go well. Now that it's looking bad for them, the establishment is really upset that the empire looks bad right now. It is not good for U.S. imperialism to be seen on the world stage as suffering such a major defeat. And what is the only remedy for that? It's having a victory somewhere else. It's having an achievement, rolling back some other government they don't like in another country. So I think people who care about peace, about self-determination, about international solidarity, is we have to be vigilant and knowing that the empire is not going to take a break after getting its ass kicked and losing in Afghanistan. It's going to be turning towards other countries that they want to overthrow for no other reason than profits and hegemony for the U.S. empire.
So you're saying Africa, here we come. I mean, we're
already building
there.
up, already started.
We're already
I mean,
there.
even Biden said it in his speech. He even mentioned Somalia in his speech, meaning that they want to escalate stuff there. So yeah, I mean, from Latin America to Africa to other countries in the Middle East, especially in Asia, the United States is going to continue to be on the warpath, and we can present a real challenge when there's opportunities to take action in the streets, and also kind of just building this consciousness, anti-imperialist consciousness, with everyone we know and everyone that we can influence.
All right. Well, thanks for all the incredible work that you do, and I'll hopefully you'll come back soon.
Oh yeah, man, anytime.
All right. Folks,
all right, later.
That was Mike Prysner. He is brilliant. His work is great, alongside his partner Abby Martin, and I was very fortunate to be able to have him on. I hope you guys learned a thing or two. One of my favorite things that I hear from chat whenever I do stuff like this is people being like, dude, what a keyboard warrior. What does he know? It's like, well, I mean, I think he knows a lot. He was personally invested and has a lot of personal experience as well. So everyone can suck one whenever they say like, oh, dude, you fucking hate veterans. You fucking hate veterans. Yeah, guess what, bitch? There you go. I had a veteran on, and I have plenty of veterans in my community as well. I can have XQ Cow on if he's like bored, or if the moment is past, but I can have him on now. But the moment is probably past for him, I assume. Unless he wants to talk.